Hi, and welcome to the Blurry Turtle Podcast. Today's podcast is sponsored by all the imaginary animals that David Attenborough keeps putting in the Planet Earth documentaries. I'm onto you, David. So, Zarazua with a great win against Keys. I was talking about this yesterday. It felt like Keys didn't have to lose this match. Kind of played hyper-aggressive throughout. Zarazua played excellent. The one thing she did really well was, when the ball was on her backhand, she created really short and sharp angles cross court. I think Keys had trouble, dealing with those and putting anything on them. Great performance from Zarazua. It does set up a situation where she should beat Parry on paper, but I think it's a different matchup stylistically. Keys used to be an easy out sometimes. She'd play great for a week and win a title and then, crash out in smaller events for a few weeks just based off impatient shot selection. And I think that kind of hurt her here against Zarazua. Zarazua just extends rallies and, frustrates you with her speed, and her backhand really never misses. But I don't think Keys, if you could have called timeout halfway through the match, you might have told her, I don't think you're really in a lot of danger here. If you did want to rely on your defense and slow the pace down a little and force her to create, I think you would have been okay. I think beating Zarazua is oddly a similar formula to beating Gauff. You just really want to isolate the forehand and keep her in those rallies. And from there, she's not the most dangerous player, so a very big surprise for Keys to lose. But happy for Zarazua, honestly, because she's been playing well lately. And, that's a career-defining win, for her. That's the player who won a Grand Slam this year, so huge for her. Playing Parry, I think it's an even match. Parry beat Kvitova in her retirement match. I don't think you want to zip someone in their retirement match, but at the pro level, it's hard to really feel comfortable until the match is over, So a good win for Parry. Kvitova, two-time Wimbledon champion and a tremendous player. One of the best servers, I think, that the tour has ever seen, and one of the most aggressive players, to really put it together and make it happen. Her and Pliskova come to mind as players that, when they're on, you want to tune in. And that's good for tennis, honestly. It's good to win. It's good to have a good career, but bringing fans in and keeping them watching and entertaining them is important too. You're playing for yourself, but there's a crowd there. So, thank you to her. She's probably not listening, but yeah, good match. Good stuff. I'll see you out there. But anyway, I think Parry's backhand is a little more patient than Kvitova, so this one should be interesting. Zarazua won their previous match in 3 on clay. I think it's a little harder to hit through Zarazua on clay. Working against that is that Parry is a better player on clay. So here I think Parry gets a little boost in her power and serve. She has a big forehand when it's hitting the court. And this is really about, the same question that Keys was asked, which is, can you manage your shot selection properly? Can you be patient? Can you direct most of your traffic to Zarazua's forehand? And, can you avoid errors? Because once there's scoreboard pressure, playing an opponent who can get everything because she's fast and doesn't really miss on one wing significantly, the backhand is tricky there. So, just employ that same strategy you'd employ against Gauff and just, isolate the forehand and, expect her backhand to go cross court and not miss. So I do think Parry can win a close one there, but really could go either way. Zarazua played excellent against Keys, just very aggressive with her backhand cross. So tricky spot, good for both of them. Good opportunity, really. I just think Parry has a little bit more patience than Keys. So maybe I'm wrong. We'll see. Son Mez playing Kostyuk should be pretty solid. Kostyuk played her in Doha this year and won 3-3. So you could expect something straightforward, but Son Mez doesn't really fall apart, situationally or because of an opponent. She competes well. Her backhand's really solid. Just beat volley nets. I think the difference there was Son Mez has a, slightly more aggressive serve and hits the ball a bit harder, with more intent on the average ball. Volley nets plays a lot of junk, a lot of slices, a lot of retrieves, a lot of height, but doesn't really have the pure power to hit through the court. And these U.S. Open courts are pretty quick if you can do that. So, Son Mez on her backhand hits the ball very solid, goes down the line well, plays aggressive. should be a good match against Kostyuk. I think Kostyuk has in her pocket that she hits the ball heavier. So Sonmez has to play her best tennis here, and Kostyuk can go two options. She can, go for her shots and try to trade. And if that's not working out, she can really grind and try to wear Sonmez down, which I think is possible. Playing an opponent you've beaten before recently, you do have a second gear. Kostyuk had been donating some matches lately, ever since the French Open, where she kind of got upset up a set and a break and just started making errors. Since then, she lost a handful of matches where she just really didn't look interested in competing or backing off the pace and just driving the ball. In a situation at a Grand Slam and against an opponent where you won before, I think you do go to that automatically rather than kind of checking out. So I think she'll get through there. It was a good win against Bolter. Katie didn't play as well as she played last week, but, still Kostyuk has looked pretty focused this week. I walked past her a few times on the grounds. She was walking a very small dog, but she looked very focused, So carry that over to the court and you're good. Noskova-Lys should be a really good match. There are a lot of good matchups this round. Stuff that, I'm going to be happy to watch. The tournament is, it's only the second round, but there's already a lot of good performances. No one's really playing poorly. No one's really crashing out. Draper withdrew, but, it happens. So I think Lys played maybe one of the best hardcourt matches I've seen her play against Jones. Obviously, 0 in the first set is tremendous, considering it was pretty even prospect coming into this. Jones had just won a title, just qualified, real heavy forehand, and Jones played really well in the second set. She was looking to break early, very consistent in the rallies. They were trading big shots. I think Lys has just continued to improve her shot making, and her speed is underrated also. She puts the ball back in play excellent, so that makes it kind of tricky for Noskova. Noskova had a tough one with Galfi, who was playing well. Galfi doesn't really move that well, though. So Lys adds an extra round of defense. And Noskova hits very flat and, does tend to play a poor game here and there. So, there's a chance here for Lys to get to the deciding set. Since she's playing the best I've ever seen her play, it sort of uncaps her ceiling. So as much as I want to give you analysis, my analysis is that, I'm not sure at this point how high Lys can go with this level, and honestly how Noskova's pace will affect her. They went to 3 in Wimbledon in the last match. Noskova's 3-0 in the head-to-head, but the further you go back, the more you get into periods where Lys was pretty new on tour and Noskova was playing better, than she's playing now. So it should be close. I think Noskova wins in 3. Just by having, the slightly bigger offense. I think Lys is going to have to do a lot of work to get there also. Cirstea is playing great. Tough test against Sierra in the first, but ran away with the second. She's coming off a title. Makova did beat her in Dubai. Last year at the U.S. Open, Makova beat her. The year before in Montreal, Makova beat her. Just a dominant head-to-head, but this one feels a little different. Cirstea just won the Cleveland title and, brought that level in here. Sometimes there's a letdown after a title, but if someone continues to play well, you kind of have to respect that level. And I haven't seen automatic tennis from Makova this year. She kind of reminds me a little of, Cam Norrie and Andy Murray after their layoff, where, the defensive prowess is still there, and you see them making those gets and you think they're back to normal, but they're not really automatic in the scoreboard anymore. Being up a break doesn't mean they can't miss shots. I think it's just a matter of not really being sure of yourself yet. You know what the shot you used to hit is, but you're not sure if you can hit it yet. So, sometimes you go safer. Sometimes you choose to back off. I think you'll see Makova slicing the ball more when she feels a little nervous in a big point. All the talent is there, obviously, to win a major. She's been, had deep runs at Grand Slams before. But this is a tricky spot. And I think what I'll tune in for, because I haven't seen them play before, is to see if Makova's slices and, the heavy topspin makes it tricky for Cirstea. Cirstea hits a pretty flat ball. And, when she's serving well, she's a, top 30 player, but she can definitely clip the net a lot. She can lose, the depth on her shot at times. Not that she lands it too short in the court, but she lands it in the net or long. So Interesting to see if Muchova can frustrate her again. Might just be a severe matchup issue. Part of the reason I think Muchova's a little bit suspect is because of recent losses, but 3 sets with Venus Williams is not great either. Venus still very tricky because she doesn't really have the mobility at this point, but she hits the ball really well. So if you're not able to make her move, it can feel, frustrating. The pressure can kind of build because the point is there if you can just get her out of there. It's the same as playing someone who's injured. If you just go to the open court a few times, you're going to get the point, but every ball they put back kind of builds pressure on your next swing because you don't want to miss, because it's there. If you can just land the shot, it tends to make people clench. So interesting to see that there. I like Cirstea going in. I think it's her best chance to beat Muchova, and I just don't think Muchova is the same exact player that she was in the past when she was beating her. Kasatkina, the recent loss to... So what I do usually after the first round is I kind of reset the level. Whatever level they bring into the tournament is what I expect them to be at, more or less, in the next round. The loss to Kasatkina, the loss to Bronzetti last week, though, for Kasatkina, is where I kind of go outside of that. It's the same kind of player as Rakimova. They both are hitting the ball pretty much the same pace, just driving the ball across court constantly. Rakimova's serving a little bit better this week. And she's on a good run of tennis. I thought Garcia played a pretty sloppy match, but played it well when she needed to, to kind of sneak through the second set. Just overall going into the third, it felt like Rakimova was fine putting her to the test again. Rather than deviating, she just kept playing long rallies, and Garcia couldn't really, escape them and couldn't really hang in them either as far as consistency. She's not at her best anymore. Obviously, Kasatkina is not going to miss, so it's going to be a long grind for Rakimova. I do expect, I think Kasatkina can win if it goes to a third, simply because I don't see a clear way for Rakimova to score. Bronzetti hits the ball a little harder than her, and is a little bit more aggressive about her depth. So, I think Kasatkina can wear Rakimova down here and get the win. But I don't see a quick way for her to win. And Kasatkina hasn't been automatic this year. Just really struggling to find quick ways through matches, the way she used to. So, expecting her to win in 3 there. But, overall, a spot I'm kind of peering at, wondering if it'll be close. Baptiste Osaka, here's one where I'll mention the odds. I feel like, Osaka at minus 400 is interesting. I thought I'd see something more like, minus 200, something like that, 2-1 odds favorite. Not that, obviously, the prices is based partially on the book expecting to balance funds. Doesn't automatically mean these are the odds of the event occurring. Osaka's a huge name. They're expecting heavy investment there. Baptiste, maybe a bit less known. But I think there's similar players as far as offensive prowess at this point. Baptiste serves really well. Siniakova came in having won a title in Europe. She won a 125K. She, made the finals in another, basically the best she's played all year. And Baptiste just turned her back. I think Baptiste has done great work on her fitness. That used to be an issue for her. She always had the big offense, but now she's able to put extra balls in play. She's had some big wins this season, last season. Just become a consistent performer on tour. And I think, she tends to lose to players who are more consistent. Osaka hits the ball bigger than her. I think there'll be a lot of rallies where both players are, rushed and just trading power and hoping the other person misses. And I think the rallies will end in misses in those spots. I didn't love what I saw from Osaka against Minin. Obviously, it's a match you're supposed to win, so there's a little pressure. It's the first round. You're not sure what's exactly gonna happen. But Osaka was broken 3 times. The majority of her service games, I felt like, were under pressure from Minin. Minin's playing well, but that's a player you don't really feel like you're going to have a ton of baseline pressure against if you're Osaka. Well, if you're a threat, to win this draw. And it's good, Osaka made a finals. It's good to have her playing really good tennis coming into this. It's good for tennis in general. It's good for her too, to get out from under some of the, pressure she's felt and the anxiety. There's a lot of back and forth about, whether she's allowed to feel different ways or whether, it's totally fair, whether she's oversharing on social media. It's just a lot of chatter. And I feel like, at the end of the day, even if some of her, computations, even if the way she ends up feeling, there might be ways to avoid it, or there might, she might be not taking everything into perspective, the way some outsiders might. I think at the end of the day, the way she reports feeling is the way she feels. So it is heavy. It doesn't matter if you should feel anxious or not. If you feel anxious, it's difficult. Anyone who's experienced that, adrenaline rush will know it doesn't help you play. It's hard to deal with. It kind of makes you just want to leave and go sit in the forest for a little bit, which, I'd recommend for Osaka. Sorry for the pause there. I just feel like, getting away from the limelight could help. She looks ready for this tournament. She's playing well. I think that's another thing too, is once you start to share your mental state online and with these people, it gets scrutinized. So now everyone's looking, there's 128 players in this draw, and only 3 or 4 of them have people looking at them to see if they're going to crack, if they're going to get upset, how they're going to react. I was watching the other day, I thought, I don't know if anyone watches Adventure Time, but, Grob and like Glod or something, there's some character. I felt like she kind of dressed like that character, which I thought was cool. But at the same time, I talked to people who were wondering, why she's wearing, that particular outfit. I touched on this, in one of the last videos, and I kind of feel like it can backfire on you. Osaka is a player who I've seen not totally happy, but, again, it's a lot of projection. Do I know that Osaka wanted to wear this particular outfit for this tournament? Do I know that, sponsors aren't influencing that or trying to sell things? Do I know, what's going on behind the scenes? Do I know, it's just a lot of projection, a lot of, you don't really have the real information. And, what she shares, if it's constantly getting scrutinized and ripped apart, yeah, she could take some valuable lessons from that. But I feel like, negative energy from the internet is not terribly productive for a person, other than teaching them that, maybe they should just, be a bit more guarded with what they share. So it's not really anything about tennis. I just feel, it's a tricky spot for her. And when she says she's having a rough time, I don't care if you have $10 million. Tons of rich people have reported that. They've said, I'm still miserable, and everybody rolls their eyes at them. But, it's maybe a little tone deaf to say you are when you have so much and other people have it much worse. But I don't think people are making it up. If they say they feel that way, they feel that way. And that's, no fun. You can have everything, you can have nothing, and you can feel different ways. There's plenty of people with nothing who are perfectly happy. There's plenty of people who, on paper it looks great, and, they're not happy, or not even aware that they're not happy. So I'm not trying to dig too deep into it, but, I just think, it's tough being in that media limelight. And, as far as tennis, I don't think it's helped her. I don't think she's playing terribly consistent here. When she hits the ball solid, she looks like she can win a major. When she misses, she looks like she can lose that point to anyone. And I think Baptiste is a bit more consistent in the baseline rallies than her. So the big question for me here is how does Baptiste move to the pace? When Osaka's crunching the ball, if Baptiste is able to put those back 1 or 2 times, I think she can win the match. She serves fairly well. Osaka does tend to block returns in play for some winners, when she gets a good read on things. So that's another thing to keep an eye on, how many unreturned serves Baptiste is getting. I just think it'll be very close. If Osaka wins, it's, 2 tie breaks. Freck against Stearns. I think Freck should win. I thought she played really well. The 3-setter against Cristea last week looks like a positive data point now. And she dismantled Gibson in the first round. Well, I feel like Stearns struggled with errors and impatience. Stearns, the thing is, Stearns has won comfortably against Freck every single time. She hasn't given up more than 6 games per match. It's a spot where maybe I'm reading a little bit too much into the frustration, but I feel like Stearns, when she misses here, is very frustrated. In her first round, when she landed a forehand to the open court, it really was unplayable. That's been the thing when she was very solid. I think when she first came on tour, she played a bit like Kasatkina, but the difference was that she had a big forehand. So she's able to land a few serves and get some points. She's able to outlast players, but the outlasting thing has kind of disappeared. She's gotten a bit more offensive as time went by. You need that against top players, and she started to compete against top players. So, you take those losses and you try to change your game. But when you're at the lower levels in these early rounds, I think Stearns wants to go back to, a bit more pushing. When she was playing Semeny Staha, I think she reverted back to just hitting the court with a bit of height with her backhand and challenging, the qualifier to beat her from there. And that's what got her the first set. Forcing the other player to play some offense, using your defense, using your speed, and then when you finally get the opportunity, when the other player does get a little nervous and just put one in play, then you have the heavy forehand to put it past them. So I think it'll be much tougher against Magdalena. Magdalena plays really consistent, hits the ball harder, I think, off both wings than Semeny Staha, and just, a tricky matchup. I guess this is the last round where I'm allowed to doubt Stearns. It's hard to pick against a player over and over again without losing some credibility. I just have seen a lot of errors, seen a lot of impatience. It's the reactions to the box that kind of get to me. It makes me feel like she's aware of it also. And, when you're aware of something but complaining about it to the box, it's more like you're not sure why it's happening at that point. And it keeps happening. So, just tricky. Be a tough test of her patience there. Obviously, with the head-to-head, she should win, but not really a lock. And oh, well, thank you, app, for going crazy. I'm enjoying that. Okay, well, not great at all, but bear with me. If you're not watching the video, app just kind of zoomed out on its own, so I'm just kind of resetting things here and making my way downtown, walking fast. Okay, Gauff had a pretty standard Gauff match, double faults, trouble on the forehand, fist pumps when she wins a point, frustration into her camp when she loses. She has, I'd say, I talked about Stearns having some frustration with her box. I think Gauff is very mature for her age, maybe very mature, period. She has a really good attitude towards things, even when she's getting frustrated. The double fault issues and forehand issues that she's gone through would have other people completely dismantling a racket every single set. But, she just gets frustrated, and that's fair. Battled through it against Tomljanovic. It was a close match. The match was high quality, much higher quality than my pronunciation of Isla's name. So, not a disaster for Gauff. I think the forehand issues and the serve issues are frequently going to be there. She did just sign on a new coach who helped Sabalenka deal with her double fault issues. I don't have the name in front of me, so I won't mispronounce it for you. But that's a good addition. If you have an issue and someone can fix that issue, go out and get them. Vekic had a good match against Buzis Monero. Buzis really had the match, I think, on her racket. Was playing well. Was getting to the end of points. Okay. The app is resetting on its own. But I'll go back, because I've got nothing better to do. I'm not touching the screen, by the way, while it's doing most of this stuff. It's just kind of getting a little glitchy, which, that's fair. It's a free app, so I'm always complaining about things that are free, but it doesn't really make sense. I should be, a little more grateful. I'll work on it. Yeah, but basically, Buzius, it felt like, she'd get inside the baseline and then would try to hit the ball a little too hard on the final shot. Maybe she wanted the rally to be end. I felt like Vekic was scrambling better than expected. Vekic is very good with the squash gets. She's tall, so she doesn't move great, but, the reach makes her decent at putting the ball back in play. When she goes all out and she's not, overthinking things or watching herself play, I think she's really competitive and played a good match. I just think, Buzius kind of fell apart. I've seen this a few times with her recently where she doesn't really have the offensive variety, tends to just go cross court heavy, until things are over. And, when she's the one supplying all the offense, she can kind of get a bit error prone. So something to look out for. Good win for Vekic. Obviously, if you're making errors and you're supposed to be the consistent baseliner, you're in trouble because the other player, Vekic is a server. So Vekic is the one who's going to hold. If you put them both at 5-4 at the end of the set, Vekic is the one probably who gets more, cheap points on the way out. So good win for her. Should be close against Gauff given the first round. I just think, Gauff is decent at resetting, and I don't think Gauff's too bad at exposing, an opponent's movement. Gauff is one of the fastest players on tour, so you can take away Vekic's drop shots. Fitness is not going to be an issue here for Gauff. It's not really talked about, but she's in very good shape. Just a hard situation for Vekic to score. But like I said, there's a formula at this point for Gauff. If players aren't just isolating her forehand, they're not so interested in winning. I felt like Zhang played Gauff recently and just wasn't really doing that, and I didn't understand why. So Vekic here, pretty simple. Go wide from the deuce court. Go tee from the ad side. She does have, a decent serving game. I think she'll lose in the end just, not being able to scramble in those long, baseline exchanges the way Gauff can. And, Isla tends to hit the ball very straight with a lot of power. And I don't think, Vekic hits the ball as hard or as solid. So, I think it's more about short points with her. And again, Gauff has had some issues. She had issues creating off of Isla's power. I think, the gets and retrieves that Vekic was making against Monero, I think Gauff will put them away a bit more comfortably. So I think slight reset there for Gauff. Anisimova playing joint. Joint played really aggressive against Kasanseva. Started to lose. The second set was down a break because she just started to make a bunch of errors. But, she reset. I think getting a break back at the end of a set and closing out is, a good sign. I don't think she'll carry over the errors to this match. Should be interesting. Anisimova is really, playing great tennis this year. Very confident. I don't think she should lose this match. But Joint is pretty good at reflecting power. Very consistent baseliner, kind of a gatekeeper at the lower level. So it'll be interesting, I think, to see, if she's able to retrieve, against Anisimova. Anisimova is the type of player who gets two swings and ends the point. So, and she will get swings against Joint, which I do think, will be the deciding factor. I think Anisimova, even if she drops a set, can just win in 3. She's done that a lot in her career. Just looks for offense until she finds her rhythm. And, hard to stay locked in on defense against her. It just feels overwhelming at a point. And yeah, you're willing to retrieve and run down everything. But, when you're not getting a racket on those balls, you start to think you have to do something different. Jacqueline Christian, 2-0 against Collins is impressive. Collins isn't always totally healthy, but that's a good result. Ashlyn Kruger won an interesting match against Kenin. Kenin was actually up an early break in the third, but just couldn't really hold serve. Couldn't really score easily. And, Kruger with a lead is very dangerous. She makes some unforced errors, right? She has some double fault issues occasionally, just very, similar, as I've said, to early Rybakina and Sabalenka. But with a lead, you don't really have that. You don't have those issues. You play a bit freer. You start to believe in yourself. And, Kruger does have the makings of a top 10 player. She moves very well also for a tall player. So, interesting spot. I am inclined to pick Christian. I think Christian can defend a little better than Kenin. I think Kenin's mechanics on her swings kind of make it hard for her to guide the ball in when she's in trouble. She's always counterpunching, especially on her forehand wing. I feel like, when the ball is deep, she's half volleying it a lot. She's taking it very early, which is useful, but it gives the other opponent a free swing. Tends to take a little of the pace off of it. With the backhand too, I feel like if you rush Kenin, she'll go deep or into the net more often. Whereas, Christian, I think, is just putting it back in play, which is, dangerous because of Kruger's power, but it earns the same errors, I think, as Kenin. And, Jacqueline serves a little bit better. So I think here Christian can win a third set where Kenin really couldn't. Kenin did have the match mostly locked up. She was up a set and a break. I just don't think Christian will make this. I don't think she gets there the same way. Kenin's playing very, very accurate offense, very crisp form of tennis. When she was at her best, she'd take the racket right out of your hand. But at this point, I think Christian is a bit more consistent than her. So, the win against Collins is something I'm impressed by. Obviously, Kruger can beat anyone, except the top couple players at this point. But it'll take a strong performance. Maya, I think she played Golubic last year in Cleveland. It was a close 2-set win for Maya. I think Golubic brings in a better level overall. She's playing really solid. She was down, a set and a break against Boisson. And Louise was serving really well too, which I felt like was a big issue. What I liked from Golubic is that she was frustrated in the first set, but not letting it affect her tennis. She was just very impatient that she got off to a rough start, and kept that level up throughout, ended up running away with the third set. So I expect her to do well here. The tricky part for me is that I don't think she has an easy way to score on Bella. Bella just, outdueled Kartal, which is not the same level of shot making as Golubic. Golubic has a really dangerous backhand, and, plays a big version of tennis for a shorter player. Just hard to see her hitting through, the exact thing that Haddad Maia does is just kind of, defend and grind out there. And, her results have been terrible this season, but winning a match gives her a chance. If you ask me who's going to win before I see the tournament, before I see the first round results, I would say that Golubic would beat her, 70-80% of the time right now. But, very dissimilar starts to the event. And, I think Haddad Maia is a tough out, having played before. Bella wasn't really doing great last season either and still won. So, Golubic at her best, it should be another really close match. I think Haddad can just run away with it in 3. Just serves a bit better, I think, also. In a big moment, she's more likely to be able to send one wide. Tough for Golubic to return that too with a one-hand backhand, and not really being tall. So if Bella has a good serving day, I think she wins. Sakkari Bondar I should check out of this one. This is very unexpected. I thought Svitolina would win. I tuned in. Bondar was playing excellent, hyper aggressive. The announcers made it sound like Svitolina didn't really do a ton wrong and still lost. So to me, Svitolina is a little better than Sakkari. Sakkari's been edging into good form lately, but I think, overall, Svitolina is a tougher out. Sakkari makes a bunch of errors. You can suffer with, confidence issues. Has a kind of glitchy backhand, not a big take back, not a very fluid swing. So I think Bondar could win again, honestly. Interesting to see if she does. I think she serves a little better than Sakkari. Just a spot where both players are, in decent form. I didn't expect Bondar to get there, but she has a big serve. Should be close, honestly. I could see that going, to a third set as well as Sakkari's playing. But, just the surprise. One of the surprises of the tournament, I think, for Bondar to beat Svitolina on hard court. Traditionally she's been much better on clay. Bondar, if you don't know her, big serve, heavy ground strokes, good athlete. Just not really the most consistent player. Just someone who, if you give them the ball, they can beat you. But if you, move them around a bit, maybe not. So Sakkari, if she can get back to her roots, when she first came on tour, she was, outlasting players in 3, really grinding them out on defense. If she can do that here, that'll be great. And the app has glitched again. Thank you, app, for humbling me again and again. Well, I guess tennis is canceled. Oh, there you go. So let's talk about tiny players for a little. Alexandrova and Wang, pretty simple situation here, although it's not really clear who's going to win. Wang beat Alexandrova in a 3rd set tiebreaker in Wuhan last year, and Alexandrova won in 3 in Cleveland the year before. So, the story here is that neither player can really defend against their opponent. Wang had a pretty good first round win against Dolehide, never an easy out. Alexandrova beat Sevastova fairly comfortably, which hasn't really been happening. Sevastova's been able to frustrate a lot of players on tour this year in her return. I think Alexandrova's, a little bit sharper right now. It's just going to come down to, who plays better in what is probably the deciding set. I don't think either player can just blank the other. Wang tends to make a lot of unforced errors at times, and then she locks into a level and wins 4 or 5 games in a row. Alexandrova, excellent backhand, not the best movement, can serve well. I think, really just wins behind her backhand. And, her forehand, pretty aggressive also. She's an aggressive returner. So if Wang is having trouble landing serves, I think Alexandrova wins. She should, it's a close match, but she's a little bit better. Zakharova, Siegemund. Siegemund had a good win against Diana Schneider, who just won the title last week. So, always good to see Siegemund playing well. Honestly, she's a really consistent player. I think she has the game to beat Zakharova. She won in their previous meeting, but it was a long time ago on clay. Zakharova beat Avanesian, who hasn't won a match in quite some time. A match of high quality, I'd say. Sorry to whoever her last opponent was. Siegemund has, a frustrating game, defends the baseline well, serves not great, but decent. I think the main thing she does is just make her opponent play a lot of tennis. She challenges them. She uses, moon balls, slices, plays the drop shot, drives the ball well. I think overall she's going to profit from Zakharova's errors. There's going to be sections of the match where Zakharova wins, 3-4 games in a row. Zakharova hits the ball huge and goes to very small targets, just hyper aggressive, like kind of picture a more mobile Ostapenko. But, it's the early years here. She has some double fault issues. She can make unforced errors. So I think Siegemund's going to frustrate her and probably win in 3 sets. Kalinskaya plays Putintseva. Putintseva finally wins a match. Good stuff. The only concern I have here about Kalinskaya winning is that, her leg was taped in the first round. She was kind of smiling and gesturing towards it, And Gunue played really solid. Definitely going to be, a contender on tour in the next couple of years. For right now, Kalinskaya was a little bit sharper on offense, a little bit more reliable on serve also, So I think she should get past Putintseva. Putintseva mostly just outlasted Cocciaretto. I think Kalinskaya's backhand is good enough to deal with Putintseva, and that's Putinseva's main game is just to make it a backhand exchange. Lamens and Swiatek, Iga played well 1 and 2 the first round. It was a very quick match. Lamens had a pretty simple one against Glozman. I don't think Lamens has the serving game to keep Swiatek from returning aggressively. And, that'll just be the end of that. I think it'll be, the kind of match that ends, 2 and 3. Swiatek is playing really well. So I'm going to throw this up now because it's getting a bit late. And I'll, post the next round tomorrow. All right.